Hi, biology students. We are going to move on today in our next step of cellular respiration, which is finding how cells get energy. Remember, that's what cellular respiration is. We talked about glycolysis in our last video. So we kind of went through just a quick review. So we're going to talk about how cells convert energy to food. We talked about what cellular respiration was, and we talked about that first step being glycolysis, or the splitting of that glucose molecule into two. Remember, glucose is a 6-carbon, so splitting glucose into two 3-carbon molecules in a process called glycolysis. Cellular respiration is broken into 3 cycles. Glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm, and then this pyruvate or pyruvic acid, it's the same thing, diffuses into the mitochondria. And it's going to go through a couple of cycles in here. The second cycle is called the citric acid cycle, where there's further breakdown of that pyruvate or pyruvic acid. And then those products made in the citric acid cycle are going to go into a cycle called the electron transport chain. So we're going to talk about the next step. And just so you know, remember we talked about mitochondria when we talked about the organelles in cells. Mitochondria, mitochondrion, same thing, just one is plural. So please don't be confused by that. Mitochondrion is just the singular form of mitochondria. So when we're talking about lots of mitochondrion, we refer to them as mitochondria. So usually we just say mitochondria because cells have many. Just a quick overview. So we talked about glucose. This is that molecule that goes through the first step of glycolysis and gets broken down. So glucose is broken down into pyruvate. Then what happens next really depends on whether the oxygen is present or not. So if there's no oxygen present, we say, and you don't have to write this down, I'll go through a concept map with you later on this. If there is no oxygen present, then it's going to go through a process called anaerobic respiration, which is very different than when oxygen is present. So the products that are produced in anaerobic respiration is ethanol, which is an alcohol, and carbon dioxide, or something called lactate. So if you're an athlete, you may have heard of lactic acid. That's what we're talking about here. So we'll revisit this in a little bit. Or if oxygen is present, it's going to go through aerobic respiration. And this is when it's going to diffuse into the mitochondria and go through the citric acid, also called the Krebs cycle. And this is where we get all the ATP produced. You will see over here, there's no mention of ATP. So in our bodies, that's a real problem if there's not enough oxygen. So again, we'll talk about that. So this is just kind of an overview. So let's take a moment to talk about what happens when there's not oxygen present. This goes into something called the anaerobic pathway. We still go through glycolysis. We still split that glucose molecule. In the absence of oxygen, in the cell, it leads to fermentation in which no additional ATP is produced. So there's a couple of types of fermentation. One is called lactic acid fermentation, and this is really what happens so if you are, let's say you're doing something really physical like running a marathon or playing a football game or running a cross-country race, something like that. You know how your body, you certainly begin to breathe, right? Take deeper breaths and more frequently when you're working out really hard. And that's because your body's saying, hey, we need more oxygen in our cells. And it's an involuntary response. Our body, prompts you to draw in more air so that it can basically extract more oxygen from that air because it's really, really needed in the cells. But sometimes no matter how much you breathe in, it just seems like you can't catch your breath and you just can't get enough. Well, that can cause lactic acid fermentation. So pyruvic acid is used up. Move my face. and something called MAD plus, and lactic acid is produced. Lactic acid buildup in muscles due to exercise is actually one of the things that causes muscle soreness. So perhaps if you are in a sport, your coach may have said a couple of things that you should do after a really hard practice or a big race or a hard game or whatever it is. There's a cool down, which is usually kind of stretching muscles. They always say make sure you hydrate, drink lots of water. Maybe an electrolyte might be necessary if you really, because when you sweat, you don't just sweat out water, you sweat out those electrolytes as well, so you may have to replace some of those. So what happens here is that lactic acid builds up in muscles, and you got to get rid of that. So stretching your muscles, really stretching helps break up or release that lactic acid, and then drinking water helps flush that from your system. So that's why we do those things. And again, it's just, there might be some cells in your body that just could not get enough oxygen because you were working hard and using it up so fast it couldn't be replaced fast enough. The other type of fermentation is actually alcohol fermentation, where lactic acid is used up, NAD plus, and ethyl alcohol is produced. This is actually how wine and beer is made. So wine and beer are made using yeast, which is a fungus, and the metabolism of yeast produces obviously some products. So if we're talking about something sitting in a liquid, it's not able to readily extract oxygen from the air. So we get alcohol fermentation. And again, wine, beer has yeast in it, and that's what causes that alcohol production is actually the yeast. There's different types of yeast for like making champagne than there is for wine. And so there's a lot of different species of yeast. But the basics of it is, that's actually how alcohol is produced in those types of beverages. So in bread making, it's the metabolism of yeast that's happening. The CO2 gas that's produced as that byproduct is what's trapped in the bread dough and causes it to rise. So that's kind of the overview of the anaerobic pathway, the pathway where we don't have oxygen present. And this does not happen in the mitochondria. This just happens in the cytoplasm of the cell. So let's talk about the Krebs cycle and citric acid cycle. So in the presence of oxygen, then we have something called aerobic respiration. So aerobic means with oxygen, anaerobic means without oxygen. We have this, so now what's going to happen is these pyruvic acid molecules, we have our pyruvate or pyruvic acid molecules now are going to diffuse into the mitochondria, and they enter this Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle. It's the same thing. Sometimes you'll see it as citric acid, sometimes you'll see it as Krebs. It is the same thing. So now remember, we have 2 3-carbon molecules that are going to be broken down through many processes. This is where we get some of that CO2 production. But we also get some of these molecules are going to become energized. Remember we said when we have things like NAD plus and we add some things get added to it and it becomes NADH, and we also have 3 hydrogen ions produced. That's going to become important in producing something called chemoosmosis and a concentration gradient in the mitochondria, and I'll explain in a moment why that's actually important. But we also look at ADP or adenosine. Remember, adenosine diphosphate has 2 phosphates on, and then with during this process of the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle, we actually get another phosphate added, and it has more energy and becomes ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. So this is that adenosine triphosphate that's going to carry all of the energy. Then we also have FAD converted to FADH2. So these represent molecules that have become energized, and they're energy carriers that are going to be further broken down, and this energy is going to be harvested in that next cycle called the electron transport chain. So the Krebs cycle is just further breakdown of this pyruvate or pyruvic acid. Acetyl-CoA is just an enzyme that's used in this process, so listed up here. But we get some carbon dioxide production. We get some NAD plus converted into NADH. That's really important. ADP converted to ATP. That's important. And FAD converted to FADH2. That's important. Oh, and then +3 hydrogen ions. So the important things are in aerobic respiration, glycolysis. After glycolysis occurs, those molecules, those pyruvic acid or pyruvate molecules, diffuse into the mitochondria, and then it enters into the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle, which is the first stage of aerobic respiration. So it produces 2 more ATP in the Krebs cycle, 6 more NADH, and then we looked at in this, let me enlarge this really quickly again, and then we get some hydrogen ions, which are also important. So we get 3 hydrogen ions for each pyruvic acid molecule, and remember there's 2, so we are going to get 6 more hydrogen ions in this process. Hydrogen ions are really just plain protons. So a proton, because hydrogen has 1 proton and 1 electron, when it gives up its electron, it becomes just a single proton. So this represents the electron transport chain. So this is within the mitochondria. What we're looking at is, remember mitochondria have this, obviously an outer membrane that encloses them, but then this pink wavy line represents the inner membrane. It has these cristae, these folds we talked about when we learned about cell organelles. And we said these folds are really important because they increase the surface area. But what happens is those products that were produced in the Krebs cycle and citric acid cycle, we had kind of carrier molecules produced and also some straight up hydrogen ions produced, which have a positive charge. And some of these other carrier molecules, like the NADH, is going to be basically stripped of its hydrogen ion. See, the hydrogen is stripped off. That ends up out here. All of these carrier molecules, the whole purpose is to build up see all these hydrogen ions on this side of the membrane? I drew them in here with pink X's. These are all the hydrogen ions. See how there's way more of them here than there is in here? It's very much like in the summertime, when you have a thunderstorm, you have some clouds, and there's actually a buildup of charges in different areas in the sky. And the way that is neutralized, nature does not like a concentration gradient. You get this big lightning bolt, sorry, yellow's hard to see on here, that actually neutralizes these charges because it's going to cause a flow of negative charges this way and some positive charges this way until it's neutral and there's no differentiation in those charges. The exact same thing happens in our cells in the mitochondria. So these protons are going to diffuse through this membrane. Let me pick a different color here. And in that process, there's actually an enzyme in here that is going to use that positive charge to produce some ATP from an enzyme that is embedded in this inner membrane. So this is the ATP. This is like a battery. There's positive charges here, not as many positive charges here. It acts like a battery to produce a whole bunch of ATP. In a nutshell, the electron transport chain is that second stage of anaerobic respiration, or the third stage of of cellular respiration, and that concentration gradient of hydrogen ions drives the synthesis of ATP.